All right, here we go. Starting the second week of all this stuff, and we're getting into the civil rights movement. To understand the civil rights movement more in depth and more broadly than in generally it's taught, we need to understand first why people protest and how people protest. It's easy just to talk about Martin Luther King speeches or some marches and stuff like that, but that's not the entirety of the story. So for background, the first thing we're going to talk about is forms of protest. So why do people protest? In general, these will be the three main reasons. Number one, to vent frustration. Martin Luther King once said that riots are the language of the unheard. So when people get angry enough and they don't feel like their voice is being heard or whatever, their complaints are being actually listened to, then people will protest or do worse. Obviously, they do it to bring attention to something. You protest because whatever's frustrating you, you think needs to change. And part of getting it to change is to get people to realize that there is a problem. So you want them to get their attention to that problem. And then the last one, of course, is to demand change. You're angry, you want to bring people's attention to something, and then eventually you want that thing to change, whether it's through political means, non-political means, social pressure, which will be a lot of the gains out of the civil rights movement will be done through moral and social pressure. But those will be the big reasons. So your first question, real quick, okay, why do people protest? Is it A, to vent frustration, B, to bring attention to something, C, to demand change, or D, all of the above? All right, so steps to changing something. Okay, number one, if you're going to change anything, the first thing you got to do is identify a problem. Okay, that there's a problem or an injustice, and it has to be identified. That's step one. Number two is you organize people that feel the same way you do about that problem you've identified. So you get a group of people that feel the same way. Then you start taking actions. So protests, strike, media blitzes, all sorts of different things could be that action, right? You try to bring about that change. And then the last step is you will gauge people's reaction. Could be positive. If they agree with what you're saying, then you go back to number two and you bring them in, you organize them in, and then you keep repeating steps 2 and 3 and 4. If it's negative, maybe you change the way you're protesting, or you just assume those people that are against you are going to be against you no matter what, and you keep doing what you're doing. But those would be the 4 steps to change. All right, now we're going to get into different types of protests. Okay, the first big group, and there's going to be examples of each big group, but we got 2 big groups, nonviolent and violent protest, and we're going to focus on nonviolent first. So, your first type of nonviolent protest would be a personal statement, and this is something that you do individually. Okay, so first one could be a letter. Oftentimes people write letters to the editor of newspapers. So if you ever look in the editorial section or the letters section, those are all personal, nonviolent forms of protest through a statement. You could write a book. Okay, we talked about The Jungle from Upton Sinclair that brought all sorts of mistreatment and disgusting conditions and stuff from the meatpacking industry. Brought that to light and brought changes with it. Same with How the Other Half Lives, which is by Jacob Riis, about how our poor and working class people were forced to live during the Gilded Age into the Progressive Age. You could put a billboard up. You could put up a sign in your front yard. You could put a bumper sticker on your car. That's another example of a non-personal a personal nonviolent statement. I'm not a big fan of bumper stickers, but some people really are. You could give a speech. Okay, the most primary example of a speech would be Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which we'll talk about a lot when we get to the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, but that'll be a couple of PowerPoints ahead of us. You could write a song, right? War by Edwin Starr, or basically every Bob Dylan song. I guess ask your grandparents about Bob Dylan. Great singer from way back when. Or you could do stuff on Facebook and Twitter, get in fights with people or not, or just everyone's got to put up their political opinions on Facebook and Twitter and all that sort of stuff and get into fights. So on the left, we got those 2 things. In the middle, we got Martin Luther King giving a speech. On the right, Bob Dylan singing one of his protest songs. Got a bumper sticker here that says, I'm already against the next war. On the right, who pays for war? Okay, it says 41% of your taxes at work. All kind of depends on how you evaluate that stuff, but about 27 cents of every dollar goes towards the military or the Defense Department, which you would easily be able to say applies to the wars we're prosecuting in various different countries at this moment. Or you could do something like this, very controversial. Both of these instances were super, super controversial. On the right, during the Mexico City Olympics, we had two sprinters hold up a Black Power fist in a protest manner. Both of them were kicked off the Olympic team after this moment, gone on to long activist careers, both of them. On the left, of course, Colin Kaepernick, famously or infamously, I should say, took a knee during the national anthem to protest police brutality and inequality in the country. Very, very controversial. People got very, very mad. President Trump made a whole big deal out of it as well. He eventually, of course, Kaepernick hasn't been able to play in the NFL since. He did win a collusion suit against the NFL, proving that they, I guess, don't want him in there. But as we talked about earlier in this PowerPoint, right, that one of the big reasons why you protest is to bring attention to something. Here are some individuals who were at the pinnacle of their professional lives but felt that something else was more important and they wanted to bring attention to it. So they took the opportunity when they knew the most people would be watching to make their protest. And they did, right, with tremendous personal repercussions against them. But they did it anyways because they felt that strongly. So these are all personal statements. All right, so next question. Personal statements as protest include two of these. Which two of them are they? Is it A, a letter to the editor? Is it B, a picket? C, a strike? Or D, a speech? All right, moving on. Next group will be, or next type of protest, of nonviolent protest, will be group demonstration. So, first example could be a meeting, like a union meeting, especially if you were in the IWW or the Wobblies, which were much more militant. Many of their meetings were types of protest. You could lead a march. Okay, lots of examples that we've talked about and more that we'll talk about as we get through the rest of the year. But the Bonus Army March on Washington in 1932, we've talked about that one. The 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, we'll talk about during this unit. The 2017 Women's March, we've had science marches. Marches are pretty common forms of protest. You can have a vigil, which is sort of a prayer session that people have often outside with candlelights at night. One big one, the annual Mothers Against Drunk Driving prayer session as an example. You could do an information booth, right? So right after 9/11, there was a lot of anti-Muslim bigotry here in the country. And at a lot of county fairs and stuff, groups of Muslims would go and they'd hold an information booth that was just called Meet a Muslim. Because generally if you get to know people, then you won't hate them as much. So that could be a type of protest. Of course, they're protesting against hatred, not really protesting against people. You could picket. Okay, a picket line is like a strike, right? But literally you'll march around where you're striking or whatever. Or a lot of anti-war protests they form picket lines in front of military installations or that sort of a thing. Or you could do a petition drive, right? The biggest example of this would be the Declaration of Independence because a bunch of people signed that. But if you want to run for office in a lot of states, you got to get a petition and a certain amount of signatures signed. Or if you want to add something to be voted on, right? In a lot of states, they've tried to legalize marijuana through petition drives to get that onto the ballot to be voted on, or other sorts of things. Back in Utah during the last election cycle, they added Medicare expansion and Medicaid expansion that started as petition drives. So those are forms of protest as well. So, big examples of group demonstrations. Here's one we'll talk about a lot during this unit, which was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. As you can see there, between 250 and 300,000 people will line the Washington Mall around the reflecting pool in between the Washington Monument and what you can't see, which would have been at the very bottom of the screen, would be the Lincoln Memorial. That's where the I Have a Dream speech happened. Other demonstrations, here's the Women's March in 2017. Millions of women marched all around the world. One of the bigger ones here in D.C. as well, but all over the country, all over the world. Other examples, here's some anti-Vietnam War picketers and marchers. And then this one on the right is just against war in general. So your next question, group demonstrations as protests include which two of these? A, songs, B, marches, C, meetings, or D, bumper stickers? All right, next type of protest will be civil disobedience or passive resistance. These are unlawful activities. Okay, knowingly breaking the law but doing so in a non-violent way was how most of the gains of the civil rights movement will come about. But that's not the only movement that uses it. The labor movement will use this. Other groups will use this. So first example will be a sit-in or a walkout. So the example I'll put on here is the Greensboro sit-ins, and I'll show you a picture here in a second, but literally people went and sat in the seats of lunch counters that were segregated. So black people would go in and sit in seats that they were told they weren't supposed to sit in. And they would sit there peacefully. They tried to order food. Obviously, they weren't served. Many of them beaten, dragged out, or arrested for doing this. But then another wave would come in, and another wave would come in until eventually they got the lunch counters to be desegregated. You could do a sit-down strike. Okay, the most extreme example of this was the 1937 General Motors plant strike. A bunch of workers sat down at the job for like a month. There was gunshots and all sorts of crazy stuff trying to break the strike, but eventually they'll get what they want. And I'll show you a picture of them as well. Trespassing, example, this would be environmentalists, especially with very controversial things like the Dakota Access Pipeline, where groups trespassed onto what was now privately owned land and tried to chain themselves to things to stop the creation of the pipeline. Just this year as well, in Hawaii, there was a movement to build this gigantic telescope on top of this sacred mountain to Native Hawaiians. So a lot of Native Hawaiians would trespass onto this now supposedly private land to protest. So those are a couple examples. You could disrupt a meeting. Right? An example of this will be the 1968 Democratic National Convention, which was a complete and utter crap show, but we'll get to that as we get further. Lots of town halls in the recent few years. I need to change that to the recent few years, where people have rightfully been very angry at their politicians. So when they hold these town halls, they yell at them, which is how it should go anyways. And most of our politicians are cowards, so a lot of them are canceling their town halls. Or you could do an illegal march. Okay, so to have a march, you need to get permits. You got to do all this stuff, and sometimes permits will not be granted. Especially during the Civil Rights Movement, they weren't granted because the people issuing permits didn't want the Civil Rights Movement to continue. So there will be some marches that begin without the proper legal paperwork, including the Selma March and Bloody Sunday, which we will talk about as well in detail as we go forward in this unit. So, examples. On the left, this was a sit-in at in Greensboro at one of their lunch counters. And you can see them sitting there peacefully while they're getting stuff dumped on their heads, and people are yelling at them and doing jerkish stuff. On the right is the General Motors strike. They've got all the seats that they're supposed to be putting in the cars that they just took off the assembly line and sat on down, read their newspapers or books or whatever while they waited for management to hopefully give in and give them better treatment and pay. Some trespassers, environmentalists, you see them on a tree. It says "Save Me," and they've chained themselves to it. So obviously the tree can't get cut down until they get removed, obviously. Then on here on the right was some protesting of the Dakota Access Pipeline. As we all know, eventually President Obama stepped in and said, we won't build the pipeline. It's one of the first things that President Trump reversed. They built the pipeline. They promised it wouldn't leak, and I think to this day it's leaked about 400,000 gallons of crude oil into the ground by the Dakota people's land, or underneath it, I should say. And then here's from the 1968, here on the left, I should say, it's from the 1968 Democratic National Convention that completely deteriorated and led to an intense amount of police brutality against protesters. On the right, the Selma March, okay, the eventual permitted Selma March. You can see there's no violence there, but we'll talk a lot about Selma here as we go. So, your next question. Civil disobedience and passive resistance as protest include two of these. Which two are they? Is it A, sit-ins and walkouts, B, trespassing, C, information booths, or D, property destruction? All right, economic pressure as a type of boycott, denying people money or profit. This one tends to be fairly effective as well because in our very capitalistic American society, a lot of people really want to make money. And if you can deny them money, you can get them to change their actions. So you could boycott a company, right? This is a personal thing. There's companies that I don't particularly love because of the way they treat their customers, so I try not to shop at those places or shop at them as little as possible. You could do an embargo. Now, an embargo is this nationwide boycott, right? So the United States of America puts embargoes on all sorts of other countries. as a way to try to get them to act the way that we want them to act, whether or not that's good or bad. But countries put it on us too. In the early 70s, we'll learn about it in the next unit. The OPEC countries of the Middle East that create mostly oil in the world, they put an embargo on the United States, and we ran out of oil for a while. We had tons of shortages and huge price increases. Or you could do a labor strike. We've talked about lots of labor strikes, okay, but that is denying profit to a company. If all the workers walk out, or they're striking outside, or they're sitting down and striking, then that company's not producing anything to sell, so they're losing money. And that's the way that labor tries to get better treatment, better benefits, that sort of thing. So, economic pressure as protest does not include which of these? Okay, it does not include. Is it A, a boycott, B, an embargo, C, a vigil, or D, a labor strike? All right, now we're on to the violent types of protests. I know my video here is not so great. I'm not quite sure why it's so bright up at the top, but now we're into the violent section. So, property destruction will be the first type of violent protest, and of property destruction, there's two types. There's secret or covert property destruction. So, 9/11 was a secret plan, right, to destroy the World Trade Centers as a symbol of American economic power, and then the Pentagon as a symbol of American military power, and then the attempt at the White House to hurt American political power, but that plane never got there. The Oklahoma City bombing obviously was a secret plan until the Murrah Federal Building exploded. So those are secret types. Open types. So the Kristallnacht, right, which is an overt type of property destruction. They were protesting what they saw as Jewish corruption and all that sort of stuff we just talked about in the last unit, but that was very obvious, very open. Same with the LA race riots in 1992 after the Rodney King beating and acquittal. Though they didn't try to hide any of their frustration there, right? It wasn't a secret plan. They started rioting as soon as that non-guilty verdict came down. So, secret plans here on the left, we got 9/11. On the right, we've got the Oklahoma City bombing. For the AP kids, we've talked about both of these things already. For the regular U.S. kids, we'll talk about them a lot more. But I know we're all quarantined, so there's lots of good movies about both of these. Obviously, I would highly recommend, for the Oklahoma City bombing, there is a PBS documentary called Oklahoma City that is on Netflix. And for 9/11, on Hulu, there's a program called The Looming Tower. It's like 6 or 7 episodes long, but it goes through all the rise of Al-Qaeda stuff, eventually culminating with the 9/11 attacks. So I'd recommend both of those if you're bored and quarantined, like the rest of us. All right, property destruction. Here's the open type. We've got the Kristallnacht on the left. On the right, we've got the LA riots of 1992. There's lots of great documentaries on that, but I know LA 92 is on Netflix, so you can watch that one as well, if you'd like. So, there are two types of property destruction as protest. They are blank and blank. Is it A, secret and open, B, public and non-public, C, government and private, or D, state and non-state? All right, physical attacks as a form of violent protest. So first will be injury. Example here, civil rights protesters were sprayed with high-pressure water hoses or attacked by police dogs. So they're injuring them. So basically it's a counter-protest to the civil rights movement protests. So they're injuring them to try to get them to stop marching. Or there could be assassinations. Obviously this is the most extreme type of physical attack, killing somebody. But examples of this, President Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth. That was a political act because he did not think that he thought President Lincoln was a tyrant and didn't think that he should be leading the country anymore, didn't think any of the things he did during the Civil War were right. Obviously, Martin Luther King gets assassinated in Memphis. Malcolm X gets assassinated in New York. Mahatma Gandhi gets assassinated. Bobby Kennedy gets assassinated, even though he doesn't really belong with those other names because he wasn't as important as them. But lots of political figures get shot, lots of social political figures or protest leaders get shot, as we'll see throughout history. So, on the left, police dogs attacking a nonviolent protester. On the right, headline, I don't know which magazine this is from, although it looks a lot like the New York Times. Dr. King fatally shot by assassin in Memphis. We will talk about all this stuff a whole lot, obviously, as we go through this unit. But we've got Lincoln here on the left getting shot by Booth. We got Malcolm X murdered, gunned down at one of his rallies. Mahatma Gandhi killed by a fanatic. It says right here. So, physical attacks as protests include which two answers? A, assassinations, B, meetings, C, op-eds, or D, injuries? Alright, I think this is the last type of violent protest, and that's martyrdom, which is self-sacrifice to promote a cause, being willing to die yourself to promote this cause. So, an example would be hunger strikes, right? Gandhi went on very famous hunger strikes and marches. So did, as I should put in here, Cesar Chavez, who we'll talk about in this unit when we get to the Latino civil rights movement. Suffragettes went on hunger strikes in prisons to protest against their treatment. Eventually we talked about how they were force-fed and they were denied access to lawyers and all sorts of things, but once the public found out about that, a lot more support went to their cause. And in cartoons, Homer Simpson goes on a hunger strike for the truth in The Simpsons. We'll show you a picture of that. Suicide as protests. Examples here, Buddhist monks in Vietnam. While the Vietnam War was ramping up, they self-immolated, which means they lit themselves on fire to bring attention to what was going on in Vietnam. Suicide bombers. Obviously, none of us agree with suicide bombers, but a lot of them carry a very political message, which we will talk about as we get into the war on terror. And then risking your life, risking your death for a cause. Martin Luther King knew he would probably get assassinated. That wasn't, I mean, it's tragic and all this stuff, but it wasn't surprising that people took shots at him. They tried to blow up his house multiple times. It wasn't the first time that he had been shot at. Okay, Malcolm X knew the same thing. Members of the Black Panthers knew the same thing. All sorts of people willing to risk their life for a cause, right? Nelson Mandela in South Africa during apartheid, which was extreme segregation in the country of South Africa, was willing to march, willing to get arrested, willing to get put in a 4-by-4 foot cage for years and years and years, protesting the conditions of black people in South Africa until he eventually got released and became president of that country. So, like I said, on the left, Homer goes on a hunger strike for the truth. There's day 9. Look how skinny Homer is. In the middle, we got Mahatma Gandhi on one of his hunger strikes. And on the right, talking about Miss Kitty Marion, who was a suffragette, who was arrested, who went on a hunger strike, and was forcibly fed 232 times. She was in so much physical and mental agony. It says in there that she was attempting to hang herself before she was able to see her lawyer, and things eventually got better, I guess, although I can't imagine that she didn't have long-term eating issues because of that. So, with the martyrdom, I told you about the self-immolating monks. They would literally pour gasoline on themselves and light themselves on fire. Happened a bunch of times in Vietnam. To talk about how bad the conditions were there. Trying to bring attention to it. All right, last question for this lecture. Martyrdom as protest includes 3 of these. Which 3 of them are there? Is it A, marching, B, suicide as protest, D, hunger strikes, C, hunger strikes, or D, risking death? All right, that's the end of that one. Until next time.